welcome to Global Journalist. I'm your host, Salam Solomon, for this week's discussion of world's news events by professionals whose job it is to report the facts and analyze the consequences. Today's topic is Ivory Coast. The political crisis is finally over in the Ivory Coast, but now the hard work of putting the country back together must begin. The standoff between the two contesting presidential candidates lasted for more than 4 months, and once the dust cleared, hundreds were dead and more than 1 million displaced. Although April 11 arrest of former President Laurent Gbagbo was an important step towards normalcy, much remains to be done by the incoming President Alassane Ouattara. The country is deeply divided, and many in Gbagbo's sizable constituency are pledging not to work with Ouattara's administration. Furthermore, production of the country's main export, cocoa beans, is in shambles. How will President Ouattara address these problems during his first months of office, and what will the future hold for the troubled West African nation? We're joined by a panel of journalists who know the country very well and can tell us firsthand about the events that unfold after the election and the factors that will determine the country's future. Ofia Quest Arcton, a West Africa correspondent for National Public Radio, Mohamed Hassim Ketia, advocacy coordinator for Committee to Protect Journalists Africa program, David Smith, Africa correspondent for Guardian, and Ange Aboua, Reuters correspondent. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Greetings from Afebia in Abidjan.
All right, Afebia, I will start with you. Reports suggest that the fighting is ongoing in certain parts of the country, and clashes were reported just yesterday in the northern Yopougon suburb of Abidjan, forcing residents to flee. There have even been reports of Liberian mercenaries mixed with the pro-Gbagbo forces. So my question is, what is the safety situation currently in the Ivory Coast, and are things getting back to normal?
Well, Tara, the latest fighting has actually been in Abobo. Now, Abobo saw some of the fiercest fighting here in Abidjan, with very heavy weapons used by the pro-Gbagbo forces against civilians and against rival forces. Now, we're told that rather than Gbagbo and pro-Ouattara forces now, there's infighting between the troops that actually propelled Ouattara to power. So that is the invisible commando in Abobo, those who defended and protected civilians there, and now the pro-Ouattara army. That is something that most people were hoping would not happen because it just complicates matters. Then you've mentioned Yopougon in the west of the city. That's where the Rump militia, pro-Gbagbo militia, are still holding up. They are fighting the pro-Ouattara forces there. They're trying to mop them up and disarm them, but they haven't managed to totally uproot them. So again, hundreds, in fact thousands of civilians have been displaced in the fighting there. So generally, Abidjan is much calmer than it was even a week ago, but we have these two pockets of violence in the city, in the west and in the northern suburb.
Oh, thank you. So, David Smith, you've written quite a bit about Alassane Ouattara. In fact, you've mentioned that although he's Muslim, his family is somewhat pluralist. His wife is Catholic and his children Protestant. Do you think his quality makes President Ouattara someone who can successfully bridge this deep divide in the country and effectively govern?
It's hopefully a good start. It gives him some credentials as a bridge builder and someone who can be inclusive. He also spent many years in the United States, both in education and then working for the International Monetary Fund. So he's quite an internationalist figure. But as so often, this can cut both ways. For years, this was used against him, and there was a whole emphasis on Ivorianness, and a question mark over whether at least one of his parents came from Burkina Faso. Therefore, he wasn't truly Ivorian, and therefore, he was not allowed to stand in past elections. And once you start beating the drum of Ivorianness, then of course there were many other people excluded as well, other immigrants from neighbouring countries. And in the violence of the last few months, we've seen high degree of xenophobic violence and West African migrants being targeted. So there's a fork in the road, and there's a choice whether to be outward going, which people who know the history of the country better than me say, over the decades, that Ivory Coast was outgoing and a regional hub and a place that many migrants went. Ouattara would be very well placed to oversee that and return Ivory Coast to those roots. I guess one would have to hope that prevails over a counter trend, which may still remain in some elements, and certainly among residual support for Gbagbo, which is to write him off as not a true Ivorian and to continue persecuting people not born and bred in the country.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to Amphibia. Much has been made of France's military role. What is the general sentiment on the street in the Ivory Coast on this subject? And are they grateful that France's intervention, or do they see it as a meddling from a former colonial master?
Let me just roll back a little, because despite what David has said about Alassane Ouattara being an international technocrat, don't forget that whoever figures you look at for the results of this election, he and Gbagbo won about half of the country each, give or take 50%. 54% we're told for Ouattara, 46% for Laurent Gbagbo. That means there are a lot of the people in Ivory Coast, Ivorians, who did not vote for Ouattara. So it's going to be very, very difficult for him to convince, as he said, that he's the president of all Ivorians. And that's going to be a huge challenge and a huge task, because many people look at Alassane Ouattara and they see trouble. They say the rebellion of 2002, they believe he was behind it. Many Ivorians have not digested that. They have not forgiven him for bringing what they say was the country to near war. And they also say that in this latest standoff here in Ivory Coast, again, you look, you see Ouattara, again, you look, you see troops, you see violence, and that he was propelled to the presidency in the long run, although he wanted to come the diplomatic route, the negotiation route, the dialogue route, he came through force of arms. So there are a lot of people who say this perhaps is not the man who should be leading this country. Having said that, the role of the French, many Ivorians, I think both sides of the divide feel that the former colonial power is a meddlesome influence here. The pro-Gbagbo forces were the propaganda against the French reached proportions that I have not seen in the 20 or so years that I've been covering Ivory Coast. But it was, after all, UN and French attack helicopters that in the end dislodged Laurent Gbagbo from his bunker in the presidential residence in Cocody. So many people are saying, is Alassane Ouattara a patsy for the French, a patsy for the West, a patsy for the international financial organizations, or is he going to put Ivorians first? These are questions that are still being asked here in Abidjan today as I speak. Many people do feel that the French role is questionable, militarily and diplomatically, in Ivory Coast, past, present, and future.
But even if the winning was 50-50, you do believe that it was a free and fair election, right?
That's not for me to say. That's for Ivorians to say. That's for the UN who certified this election to say. And that's for others to say. All I'm telling you is on the ground what Ivorians are saying. Many feel that the whole political class in Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara, Laurent Gbagbo, the former president Henri Konan Bédié, Guillaume Soro, the current Prime Minister, who was also Gbagbo's Prime Minister, Charles Blé Goudé, who was Laurent Gbagbo's chief rabble-rouser and youth minister, they felt that the whole political class should have been swept out because they cannot take Ivory Coast forward. It's a view that you still hear here in Ivory Coast, so that's why I'm sharing it with you.
Thank you. So we're also joined by Mohammed. Mohammed, are you with us?
Yes.
Thank you for joining us. So you've reported about different kinds of struggle between Gbagbo and Ouattara, a struggle to control the media. This played out most notably at RTI, the state TV station, which served as the mouthpiece for pro-Gbagbo propaganda throughout the crisis until it was captured by Ouattara forces. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the media war was like in Ivory Coast?
Yeah, much of the political struggle was largely fought through partisan media outlets. And the media was one of the institutions that both camps attempted to seize control of. Even a year ago, in January 2010, control of RTI was a contentious issue. If you recall, the opposition had organized a mass protest to the headquarters of RTI to demand more airtime for dissident views on the national public broadcaster. And when the crisis began, the first thing that the Gbagbo administration did was to, of course, censor international news media, especially French news channels, which were reporting on the results announced by the Electoral Commission. And then we saw a tit-for-tat reprisals between both camps, essentially targeting journalists from their rival outlets. And we've even had, unfortunately, casualties in the media workers that have been murdered in this tit-for-tat violence. Now, since the tables have turned, though, we're chiefly now concerned about the safety of journalists of the pro-Gbagbo media. Many of them have gone underground and are reporting threats. Many of them are running for their lives, despite assurances by the Ouattara officials that they will ensure that all journalists are protected and that they will not commit the same mistakes as the Gbagbo administration. We're still concerned, especially because of the precarious security conditions. It is largely unsafe for journalists from outlets that were identified as being close to Gbagbo to operate. And the media infrastructure needs to be rebuilt as well. RTI was shelled. The newsrooms of some pro-Gbagbo newspapers were ransacked by rebels. The headquarters of the Ivorian state news agency was looted, and many other journalists have fled Abidjan. We are aware of at least a dozen journalists of actually pro-Ouattara newspapers who fled at the end of March and are still out of Abidjan, and many of them feel unsafe returning at this point because of the circulation of small weapons and the high possibility of reprisals from pro-Gbagbo militants.
Okay, David, did you get any intimidation during your stay in Ivory Coast while reporting as a foreign correspondent there?
I think I was relatively lucky, and people were, willing to speak to me and sort of in a generous spirit. But I was certainly on my guard because I'd heard numerous reports and warnings from other journalists on the ground before me, and at the same time, a hotel that I stayed in when I visited last month, was targeted by some armed groups, and some people were kidnapped from there, and the journalists who were staying there, had a very emotionally difficult time. Some of them, and in the end, were taken from there by the French military, and there were. Particularly around the time that Gbagbo's residence was under attack, it was sort of difficult to move around. A lot of warning that sort of white Europeans particularly would be a target because of the role of the French and the hostility towards the French. So it's certainly been a very difficult climate, and I think I was one of the lucky ones.